Today we are having our week 3 recap of the situation in the raid. We are looking at the popularity and the performance of the specs in the raid after 3 full resets. Also, of course, comparing the results with last week. After the first 2 weeks of the reset, this is what we had. These were the overall performances of the specs in the raid. We have mentioned the specs at the top, the specs at the bottom, what changed from week 1, the changes of course in their performance going boss by boss as more bosses get logged with more progression of the guilds in the raid. Now, in week 3, when we put them side by side, these are the changes. We see a drop of Demo Warlock. We also see the biggest drop because Demo lost like 11 ranks from week 2 to week 3. Talking about losing, you also had Outlaw Rogue losing quite a few positions, and then talking about gaining, you had Windwalker, Arms and Fury getting into the top 8 of results this week. What remained consistent though were the top and the bottom, because at the top, after the first couple of weeks, we mentioned Destro, Frost DK, Marksmanship, Arcane and Elemental. And then you look at them this week and they are the exact same. Also, there is no underdog story at the bottom. Last reset, we mentioned Feral, Balance, BM, Augmentation and Devastation, as well as Enhancement being amongst the worst performers in the raid. It has been a week, there have been more logs in the raid, more new bosses added in the logs, no change, no difference for these specs. Now, let's just start outing the first fraud of these ranks, which is Arms Warrior. Looking at these results, you would think Arms is in the top 7 of the results, one of the better specs in the raid. And that is why it is so dangerous to just blindly check the overall results like they are very representative of the results of each spec in the raid. You can look at the first boss, Plexus Sentinel. You can see that in single target, Fury is easily outperforming Arms. Then you have Lumitar, which is a mostly single target fight. Fury is again doing excellent compared to Arms. You have Soulbinder, add phase, DPS, 3 to 4 targets with the more targets in the middle at once. Fury is still outperforming Arms. On a Raz, where you require a bit more burst because the adds have to die a bit faster, you just see the first time Arms is barely by like 2%, not even 2%, outperforming Fury. Then you go back to Soul Hunters. This is where you think Arms gets their good performance, by being 3rd on Soul Hunters. However, this is a rather irrelevant result. There is 7 logged fights of Arms in this fight, compared to the thousands or several hundred of other spec results. Then you go back to a pure single target fight like Fractillus, and then on Nexus King you have not even a single Arms available so far. So basically, in short, this makes no sense for Arms to be even slightly ahead on average than Fury. You have better overall average representation of the results from Archon, where Fury is ahead than Arms, or even WoW Meta, where Fury is even further ahead than Arms in terms of results in the raid. It is definitely not as close as Warcraft logs would suggest. And you get a better idea from looking at why exactly are Fury Warriors being played 10 times more than Arms Warriors so far in the raid. The result of Fury itself, as we mentioned, is more legit. You see Fury doing well in multiple fights, ranging from a pure single target fight like Fractillus or a more diverse kind of fight like Nexus King. They do have some pretty powerful windows in here. For example, one of the good results they can have in Nexus King is their add damage in the add phase. Nexus King is a fight where you have to juggle your cooldowns, because unfortunately for the DPS, the add phase comes right before the phase where the boss takes double damage. So you have to sort of figure out who can or who should dump their cooldowns in the add phase and who should save them to do as much single target damage as possible. And Fury more often than not, since their burst single target is quite average to poor, is selected to go all out in add damage, which does very well on Nexus King. But even then, in terms of consistent single targets, so for example the entirety of P1 or the consistent single target in P3, which also has execute, is where Fury does much better. Same goes for a pure single target fight like Fractillus. Fury is doing great. So their result is much more real, is much more legit than the current results that you have seen from ARMS in terms of performance. When it comes to the melee DPS, they are the best one overall, right below, more or less consistently, right below Unholy DK, and even ahead of Windwalker, which is sort of padding here and there in a few ad fights, especially early on in early bosses, less relevant like Soulbinder, who cares. We have already talked at this point a few times about the top 5, the ones that included Marksmanship and Frost DK and Elemental, as well as the Destro lock, so there isn't much to say at this point. We can mention once more the reasoning behind Destro doing so well. There are just so many different fights where they can gain extra value from their Havoc or even from their tier set, giving them extra free multi-target damage thanks to Eye Blast. You know, you see a fight like Lumitar, you see the damage done to the ad, which is quite important because if they don't die, you die. You see that Warlock, whenever these ads come out, will be first or second in damage, right? Matching a Marksmanship Hunter or an Elemental Shaman. The difference though is that while this damage is happening, so while, you know, the damage of the ad is going on and these specs are doing damage, you also check the boss damage and the Hunter is here, while the Warlock is still here. The Warlock is able, thanks to Havoc, to still keep up damage on the boss while the Hunter isn't really, which in the end will give you the very high damage on the boss of the Warlock while they are still having very high damage on the ad. So every fight that has these kind of mechanics, like the ads spawning on Lumitar, but also the ads spawning on Nexus King, the ads in P1 and in P2, the intermission of Dimensius also will be very favorable for Destro Warlock. Pretty much all of the mechanics where you get to hit a couple of targets are very favorable for Destro, which right now is what gives them a pretty reasonable gap actually from the rest of the specs. Even this time this isn't some kind of fraud only existing on Warcraft logs, it is followed up in other tracking meters where Destro is some 3 to 5% ahead of the other top specs. We mentioned the culprit of this is that in the past Destro used to have this power, they always had this kind of power, but it was at the cost of having good single target. So they are able to do super turbo AoE with Rain of Fire or very good to target damage with Havoc because their average single target was quite low. But then you go in a fight like Plexus Sentinel, which is pretty much mostly single target, and Destro is still very high. Even in a fight while Nexus King, where sure there can be some ad phases and whatnot, P1 though, which is pretty much mostly exclusively single target, Destro is still amongst the best performers anyways. That's the power up of Destro this tier, the fact that they still have this multi-target power while still maintaining their high single target, which wasn't something they had in the past. Now, the beauty of some of the results you can find in here is that some specs can flip-flop between being very good on a certain boss and then being very bad on other bosses, so the average will look like something in the middle, like Shadow Priest, for example. You know, you would think Shadow Priest is something like 1 or 2% behind Elemental, so it's almost right there with Elemental, right? The reality is that you go back to a pure single target fight, Elemental is here, Shadow is here. They are nowhere close to each other, or even close to Marksmanship, another one of the specs towards the top, or Frost DK. You move over next to Soul King, Unholy is still here, Destro is still here, Marksmanship is still here, Shadow Priest is down here. but they can do very well on a few fights, like having spread dot damage on soul hunters. Even targeting different pylons on Araz is what is spiking their overall performance a lot in these meters. So the overall performance will look somewhat in the middle or somewhat consistent, but it's really because on some fights they are quite high, on the others are quite low, so they will end up somewhere around here. Right next to specs that are actually here, because they are here very often. If you look at, like we just mentioned, the pure single target on Plexus Sentinel, Ret is in the middle. And then more pure single target on Fractillus, Ret, it is slightly higher up because this fight is very favorable to melee. So you see most specs here are all melees, and the casters go way down because of this kind of fight. Back to Soul Hunters, Ret is in the middle. Let's add some AoE, like Araz, for example. Ret not doing too well. Soulbinder, Ret is here. They are not really going towards the very bottom or the very top in practically any fight. They're just very consistent. So they match Shadow Priest, even though for very different reasons. Shadow Priest gets here because sometimes they are here, sometimes they are here, and they end up in the middle. Ret, on the other hand, is just most of the time around here. Now, we also have mentioned no improvements towards the spec at the bottom. This is consistent with what we said last week, but also with the same asterisk that some specs in here do get to be good sometimes, okay? Lumitar, Feral is in top 6 results. You have then Fractillus, which is single target, pure single target. Feral is top 3. Unfortunately, that is just about what they excel at. So as soon as you move out of this, like Soul Hunters, Feral is in the bottom half. When you're talking about AoE, Soulbinder, Feral is towards the very bottom. Araz, Feral is towards the very bottom. You go up to Nexus King, Feral is towards the bottom again. So they do have some situations where they do well, pure single target, but it's just overall not enough to have them perform well, especially when other specs that still can have good single target overall also get to have good damage somewhere else, like Destro, as we mentioned, or Unholy, or Arcane, or Marksmanship. So at that point, why would you bring a spec like Feral that can only do well when they are fighting in single target? We have had our first slight change when it comes to healers. We have gotten first, for the first time, Preservation being slightly ahead in first, and now the first drop of Holy Priest. Now Holy Priest is closer to these bottom 3 than they are to the top 2. What is still quite funny is that this functions very differently than DPS. When you look at the popularity of the DPS, you're looking at specs like Arcane, Frost, Destro, Ret, Havoc, Elemental, Marksmanship, Fury. And then you look at their performance, you know, Fury is here, Elemental is here, Frost Decay, Arcane, Marksmanship, Destro. So pretty much all of them being popular are also the ones at the top in damage. So you're matching who is doing well with how much they are being played, presumably because they are doing well. Then you look at the healers, and the top 2 are Preservation and Mistweaver. Then you look at the popularity. Preservation is here, Mistweaver is here. You put together the 2 best specs of the tier, and they are fewer than Holy Priest and fewer than Resto Shaman, and still below both Resto Druid and Holy Paladin. So completely differently than the DPS. Doesn't matter if they are currently showing up as the best, they are not nearly as popular as pretty much any of these specs. It mostly really has to do because when it comes to DPS, it's way more important to hit certain damage checks and damage windows in bosses, whereas healers can get away with healing phases with different comps. As long as you can heal them, as long as you can survive, it's fine. So there's not really nearly as much of a rush to play the meta healers, and also just due to innate popularity. Mistweaver is not a very popular spec, and neither is Preservation, while Holy Priest is consistently one of the more played specs. Even if we were to down rank this to Heroic, where you have a much smaller necessity for meta comps, and you look at the popularity, Resto, Holy, Resto Druid, and Preservation and Mistweaver, right? It's the same thing. In fact, it's even worse because now Restoration is 3 times more popular than Mistweaver and 4 times more popular than Preservation. So it does get, of course, smaller in Mythic because the comp gets a bit more important, so there are more preservations compared to Heroic, but still there is a significant gap from the top 3 healers. But as we said, it is more expected or more acceptable for healing comps to be less min-maxed than DPS comps, whereas for DPS comps it's more likely you're gonna have players trying to play the absolute best damage dealers, whereas for healers there is more room and more windows to have different comps. In short, this is what we have seen at the end of the 3rd week of the tier. We have seen drops in performance for a few specs, namely Outlaw and Demonology Warlock, with some increases, legit increases like Windwalker and Fury, and a couple of frauds like Arms Warrior, not really matching their actual performance with their overall performance shown in Warcraft logs, for example, as well as, more importantly, the continued good results of the top 5. The Destro lock, Arcane Mage, Frost DK, Marksmanship Hunter, and Elemental Shaman, which have remained towards the top of these results from week 2 to week 3. That's what we have seen at the end of this last reset. And with this being seen and done with, we can also stop our weekly recap of the raid results on this Friday, I believe. So, with this out of the way, it is now time to leave each other on this day as well, right, according to some experts at the beginning of the weekend. We're starting our goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I don't know, man, I thought the heat was over. Today it almost came to me putting the AC back on. Almost.